thank you for your patience as we tackled with a technical glitch. My name is Sean Quimby. I'm the director of Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Tonight's lecture, See Wright Mills at Columbia, is the second in our Live from the Archive series, which highlights scholarship that emerges from the collections held by the Rare Books and Manuscript Library. In turn, the series forms part of a very active public program hosted by RBML that includes the Book History Colloquium, a series of gallery talks relating to exhibitions, and the forthcoming Paul O. Christeller lecture on medieval and Renaissance studies. For more information about these events, I encourage you to check out our website at library.columbia.edu. The coordinator of this series is Ty Jones. He's the Lehman Curator for American History with RBML. In his day job, he works to expand and interpret Columbia's collection of rare books and manuscripts that document various aspects of American history. He's the author of 2 monographs, including More Powerful Than Dynamite, Radicals, Plutocrats, Progressives, and New York's Year of Anarchy, which Noam Chomsky described as an impressive piece of work, and the New York Times as an engrossing account of the events of 1914. He's also a giddy, if somewhat sleepless, new father. And so with that, I turn things over to Ty, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, on a snowy spring night in New York. This is a particularly tricky introduction because both C. Wright Mills and the Baffler defy easy description. Not only do they defy it, you get the sense that they actively reject it and are offended by it. As a member of the Columbia faculty from 1946 until his untimely death in 1962, Mills was simultaneously a leading sociologist and a leading critic of academic sociology. He was not quite a Marxist, nor a labor intellectual. He was not affiliated with either Soviet socialism or liberal anti-communism. He did not engage fully with the civil rights movement and died before the rise of the New Left. He was an independent intellectual. In the context of Morningside Heights at mid-century, he was unique. A huge, alarming Texan who cursed, rode a motorcycle, and waged a decades-long fight against his colleagues. He delivered lectures in cowboy boots and leather jackets, described himself as a prophet who came in from the desert, and decried most sociology as heavy-duty theoretical bullshit. We are pleased to welcome John Summers, editor-in-chief of the Baffler, to discuss C. Wright Mills' years at Columbia as part of an in-progress biography that has drawn widely on RBML's social science collection and collections from university archives. The technical problem that we hope to solve will lead to the playing of never-before-heard audio materials from the Columbiana collection. Summers is a former lecturer in American Studies here at Columbia. He is the author of an essay collection, Every Fury on Earth, and has edited books of criticism by James Agee, Dwight MacDonald, and Mills. As its name implies, the Baffler also is not easy to pin down. In a praiseful article in today's Washington Post, it is described merely as a left-wing journal. But how many of those would dedicate an entire issue to an examination of the fashion industry, as the new Baffler does? Founded in 1988 as a magazine of art and criticism, it has been variously described as a punk literary magazine and a printed magazine of unconstructed thinking. Summers, who took the editorship in 2011, has ushered in a new fluorescence for the journal, which features regular commentary from such leading intellectuals as Thomas Frank, Rick Perlstein, Nicholson Baker, Barbara Ehrenreich, Susan Faludi, and David Graeber. The best way to get a sense of the journal, other than subscribing to it, which everyone here should do, might be to scan some recent blog posts and articles, which include an expose on the Ferguson police scandal headlined, "A Cat Photo Approach to History," a piece on hipster fashion entitled, "The Revolution Will Probably Wear Mom Jeans." Noise from Nowhere is an essay on cable news, while a think piece on sadomasochism and the economic crisis is entitled 50 Shades of Late Capitalism. This is must-read journalism, and despite, or maybe because of the gloss and the irony, it speaks directly to one of Mills's most trenchant observations, that, quote, "In a world of widely communicated nonsense, any statement of fact is of political and moral significance." Please join me in welcoming John Summers.
That's very nice. Very well said. All those subjects come up, and we can just talk about all of them at once. But today, I'd like to first check that you can hear me okay, and second, assure you that I will be focused. Wright Mills, Columbia. Does anybody, before I start, because there'll be some hard words being spoken today, mostly in quotation, does anybody here in the room know or knew Robert Merton, Paul Lazarsfeld, or C. Wright Mills? Yes?
I was on a committee with Bob.
You were on a committee. Which department? In the sociology department.
He was in the sociology.
Yes, you were. I see. You were on a committee.
Oh, no, I first you were a sociologist.
And Harriet Zuckerman is here with us tonight.
I was a graduate student of both Bob Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld. I taught in the department for 21 years, and I was married to Robert Merton.
So you qualify. Anyone else? Paul Lazarsfeld, Robert Merton, or Mills? Okay, so I think I have the field. The Power Elite hooked me. I read that book, the third installment of C. Wright Mills' great trilogy of American civilization, sometime during the Clinton administration, just after, as you will recall, the end of history. The book tapped a vein in me that's been flowing for longer than I care to remember. Like other history graduate students in the 90s, I'd been reading around in the revival of pragmatism literature that blew through the postmodern academy with a post-Cold War tailwind. And I kept noticing some surprise that Mills's name kept coming up there. I learned soon, though, that before he turned himself into a best-selling popular author, he'd written his dissertation on John Dewey, William James, and Charles Peirce, the original pragmatists. He called them his godfathers. Mills's dissertation, which was never published in his lifetime, was all but impenetrable to me, but such was its importance in the 50s that it had moved like samizdat in the underground intellectual culture. I took his early engagement with pragmatism as my own point of departure and jumped in. My graduate advisor at the University of Rochester had written a masterpiece of intellectual biography on John Dewey. And because graduate school there and everywhere else is about mirroring your betters, I knew I could win his support. I would write an intellectual history of pragmatism in C. Wright Mills' social thought. I would trace the characteristic qualities of the pragmatic attitude from his early, highly technical studies in the sociology of knowledge to his colorful career at Columbia and down to his last stand in Havana. Just as Hegel was famously said to have left a permanent deposit in John Dewey's thought, I would show how Dewey's pragmatism left a permanent deposit in Mills's. And by showing the fundamental consistency underlying his intellectual personality, I could honor a directive from the Rochester History Department's patron saint of broken links and tragic notions, Christopher Lasch, who had beckoned young historians like myself to reconstruct traditions of independent thought, and who had died the year before I arrived in Rochester. And if I had stuck to that plan, it's possible that I would be standing before you today as a tenured professor of intellectual history, a salaried academic professional in good standing, rather than an ex-academic, an interloper, and a critic hanging on by the seat of my pants. What happened was I read The Power Elite, and it floored all of my abstractions by subverting my early deference to expertise. Much later, I found in the special collections upstairs a never-published manuscript by Mills's longtime colleague, the historian Richard Hofstadter. It was a response to The Power Elite that summed up my own feelings at the time. And I'm going to quote, "The sight of an American academic trying courageously in these times of danger and complacency to confront the large issues of the world from a notably rebellious point of view is in itself a thing to command attention and respect. No other American writer has attempted in recent years to analyze in a fundamental way the exercise of power. And Mills presents us with the distinctive phenomenon of a sociologist with a style, a phenomenon we have not seen since the days of Thorstein Veblen." Right on, I thought, a distinctive phenomenon. That's what I would take as my subject. I couldn't write any more a narrow-gauged intellectual history. I had to know all about the kind of person who would brave such a book, how he had come by his Promethean aspirations, how he had managed to juggle his work and his life, why he had died so young, and what lay behind the passion and the drive that that were so evident in all of his work. Writing a proper biography now intrigued me, but it also made sense on the subject's own terms. One of the first things I realized was that most of the thinkers and writers whom I admired never split their work from their lives, said Mills once, writing to his imaginary friend Tovarich. It was a choice of how to live as well as a choice of career. For whether he knows it or not, the intellectual workman forms his own self as he works toward the perfection of his craft. And so I came early to the conviction that to realize my own potentialities and opportunities, says Mills, I had to construct a character. Somehow I realized that I must learn to use my life experience in my intellectual work, continually to interpret it and to use it. Following along, I set out to write a biography of the character that Charles Wright Mills created from his life experience, starting in the 1930s, when, during high school in Dallas, he began keeping his journal, and winding up in the 60s, when his writing fomented mass unrest in every industrial country in the world. I came to see Mills as an American version of a wider phenomenon, a spiritual descendant of Stendhal's Julian Sorel, Turgenev's Bazarov, and Jack London's Martin Eden, one in a long line of new men born into the provinces of the new mass societies. Sons without fathers, non-party revolutionists, they were intellectuals as well as actors, roles between which they acknowledged no need to choose. And Mills, in fact, and indeed coined the now ubiquitous term public intellectual in 1958. And my favorite early find among the documentary record was a CIA report called Restless Youth from 1968, 6 years after Mills's death. The report picked out Herbert Marcuse, Frantz Fanon, and Mills as the three most influential intellectuals in the world. And everything else I've learned since then has proven that at least this one time, the CIA got it right. So I began my research by spending time in special collections like the one upstairs, digging like a junkyard dog through every pertinent scrap of paper I could find, and by talking with every person who knew him. I set out to write an expansive, unstinting, and reliable biography of the man on his own terms. Every chapter would contain portions of biography, criticism, and history, mixing in a style that describes Mills's personal and professional growth, evaluates his writing, his lecturing, and his teaching, and locates the story in relation to the characters, settings, institutions, and events through which he moved. The challenge, as I still see it, lies in marrying a really extraordinary range of personal and subjective judgments about Mills to the rigor and respect for facts of scholarship. One reason that I'm here with you today is to share with you some findings from the collections at Columbia, which was, on the face of it, and as you'll soon hear, a starkly ambivalent setting for his life experience. To some people on the campus, Mills was a culture hero. To most of the others, including his senior colleagues in sociology, Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton, he was an embarrassment. Sociology students and faculty whom I interviewed all told me his name was a dead letter in the department as early as 1964. He was, nevertheless, an important figure in the Columbia community from 1945, when he first came to campus, until his death in 1962. And to much of the independent, literate public in New York, he virtually defined the university's cultural and political aspirations. To the New Left, Mills's standing at Columbia was a matter of political importance, as apocrypha circulated about his academic career long after his death. In The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology, for example, Alvin Gouldner asserted that Mills had never made it to full professor at Columbia. Not true. He was promoted in 1956. A German translator of Mills's textbook, Character and Social Structure, claimed that he had lost his professorship in the McCarthy purges. Not true. He was not touched by those by that time. But then a Yugoslavian journal of social science repeated the error, and on it went in the 60s. The most interesting rumor that I found was that, and picked up from some Columbia students, was that Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton had conspired to murder Mills in the basement of the 116th Street subway station. I've been at this for a long time, but I have not found any evidence of attempted murder. But I would like to take you through, briefly, 3 standout moments in Mills's career at Columbia. The first has to do with his unlikely hiring to direct a field study in Decatur, Illinois, on behalf of the Bureau of Applied Social Research. One day in January of 1945, Robert Merton surprised Mills with a telephone call. Would he come up from the University of Maryland, where he was currently teaching, and pay a visit to the Bureau? Well, so far as professional interests went, Merton and Mills had a lot more in common with one another than either man shared with Paul Lazarsfeld. For several years beforehand, Mills and Merton had engaged in a vigorous correspondence about the sociology of knowledge, crossing pens over matters highly technical, but agreeing wholeheartedly about the need to develop in the United States what had been a European preoccupation. Merton, having studied with Talcott Parsons, came to the field after reading Emile Durkheim. Mills, having studied with Chicago-trained sociologists at the University of Texas, came to it from Dewey and in particular from George Mead. For the theoretical acuity of their early essays in this emerging field, Merton and Mills were widely considered two of the most promising young sociologists in the country at this time. And there was another more personal affinity. Unlike Lazarsfeld, who came from a politically prominent, highly educated family in Austria, Merton and Mills were more or less on their own. Merton was born in Philadelphia to immigrant parents. His father had worked as a carpenter and storekeeper, and he had attended Temple University on scholarship. After graduate school at Harvard and after a brief tenure at Tulane University, he joined Columbia at the age of 31, already considered a leader in the field. Mills was born in Waco, Texas, into a middle-class home. His father was a traveling salesman, without much of a tradition of cultural aspiration or achievement. When he graduated from high school in Dallas, his father sent him to military school. He transferred to Texas the next year. Like Merton, Mills proved himself in the state school, caught the attention of older men in graduate school, and looked upon the expanding field of sociology as a way up and out. Such were the expectations laid up around Mills. The sociology department at Maryland gave him his first job in 1941 as an associate professor, allowing him to leap over the assistant rank completely. This was before he had finished his dissertation. On one Friday night in January then of 1945, Lazarsfeld, Merton, and Mills, three men whose combined work would transform American sociology and virtually define Columbia sociology, met in Manhattan for a 7-hour conversation jag. Over a big meal in an expensive restaurant, the conversation passed over the assignment to go to Decatur, Illinois, and study public opinion. They talked about the moral problems involved with commercial research. Now and then, several young women from Smith and Vassar, who had been invited to the table by Lazarsfeld to seduce Mills into joining the team, spoke in sugary voices. And after the women departed, Lazarsfeld set forth the terms. Mills was to have the title of Research Associate at the Bureau of Applied Social Research. He was to go to Decatur, Illinois in the summer and direct the opinion study. He could publish under his own name, and if all went well, he might expect to join the sociology faculty at Columbia on a permanent basis. Mills reported the evening in a starry-eyed letter to his parents. After they had laid out the job and said, "Well, that's it, we want you, will you come?" I said, holding myself in, bursting with joy at the whole idea, Christ, I'd go for food and shelter. Anyway, I kept my face immobile and I said, "For how much?" They wouldn't say, but replied, "You know what you're worth, name it." To which little Charlie said very quietly, "I won't charge you that much, but I couldn't think of it in terms less than $4,500. Immediately the guy said, "Then your beginning salary will be $5,000. To which the appropriate reply was, "That's closer to what I'm worth." And everybody laughed and felt good. On January 26th, the next week, having secured a leave of absence from Maryland, Mills wrote to Lazarsfeld to accept the offer. Each week that spring, he rode the train from Washington to Manhattan, spent one day at the Bureau, feeling his way around his offices on 59th and Amsterdam, getting to know his colleagues, learning about the campus. Meanwhile, on campus, a huge fight was raging. Those opposed to the hiring of Mills at Columbia feared that Lazarsfeld and Merton were using him to drive the Bureau closer to the university and its plentiful resources. In this, they were correct. At the end of May, as Mills set out for Decatur, the Bureau signed its first formal agreement with the university. So Mills enters basically through the back door. And there's immediate suspicion of his motives, and there's suspicion of Lazarusfeld and Merton and their motives. And that's important for the story later. That's the first moment. That's the point of entry. The second moment, which has never been reported, as far as I know, by anybody, comes in 1956 and 1957, when Mills tried to block Daniel Bell from coming onto the sociology faculty. There were personal as well as professional reasons behind this, and I found all the evidence for it, or the evidence that gave me the sense that I knew what had happened, over at the Columbiana archive in the papers of David Truman. And before Bell died, I had the pleasure of showing him what I found, and he was utterly shocked. Well, he said he was shocked. He was a wily guy. So let me give you a little bit of background about sociology in the 50s at Columbia. Faculty here who were giving courses in sociology drew from no fewer than 5 different administrative units. In addition to Columbia College and the graduate school, there was the School of General Studies, there was Barnard College, and there was the Bureau. Lazarusfeld, who ran the Bureau, supposed that a greater number of sociologists encircled Morningside Heights in the 50s than the total number of sociologists at all French and British universities combined. And Mills felt himself to be virtually alone. Now, part of the reason for this was the intricate status hierarchy that was governing sociology at this time. It was a strictly bureaucratic separation of roles, responsibilities, and rewards. These 5 administrative units basically shaped themselves into an oligarchic pyramid, with the Bureau occupying the bottom, where most of the women worked, by the way, General Studies, Barnard, and the college filling out the middle, and with the graduate faculty lording over the whole. Now, Mills was a member of the college, and he had his offices in Hamilton Hall, and he had to teach the Contemporary Civilization course to freshmen and sophomores. Lazarusfeld and Merton, members of the graduate school, had their offices in Fairweather Hall, and as far as I've been able to tell, maybe I'll be corrected, never taught any undergraduate courses at all. As a member of the college, Mills had no political rights over hiring decisions. It's the key point of reproduction, of course, in the profession. Now, the full sociology faculty convened once a month in meetings that Mills had the right to attend. Formally, he held the right to teach graduate students as well. Sociology courses at Columbia were apportioned under 5 levels of hierarchy. The lowest 3 levels were reserved for the undergraduates. The highest level were reserved for the graduate students. And level 4 courses were open to graduate students as well as to juniors and seniors in the college. On the few occasions that Mills taught one of these 400-level courses, he attracted stray graduate students who found his writings as stimulating and as sophisticated as anything going in their graduate professors. And yet Mills gave nobody the impression that he was interested in graduate students. All the influence that he collected was concentrated in the college among the undergraduates. There, in fact, he was the departmental representative for sociology, the closest thing to a department chair, reporting to the dean of the college. Now, while Mills cultivated a stable of undergraduate apprentices in and around the college, Lazarusfeld and Merton formed a powerhouse of theory in the graduate school. Now, Lazarusfeld was a squat and cigar-chomping, loud-talking refugee, and Merton was an elegant, polished, ironical son of South Philadelphia. They made an unlikely pair. On the matter of Mills, though, they formed a social and methodological alliance that immediately sent a book like The Causes of World War III, which is Mills's best-selling anti-war book, anti-war pamphlet in 1958, straight to the dustbin. Either Merton or Lazarusfeld held the title of executive officer of the graduate department ever since 1949. Alone and together, they offered the completest, most sophisticated, most professional training in the history of American sociology. A golden rung on the ladder from college to career. Thanks to Merton and Lazarusfeld, the very best students from the New York metropolitan area and elsewhere came to Columbia for their sociology doctorates, whereupon they graduated into white-collar jobs in advertising agencies, foundations, research institutes, and other universities. The hiring of professional sociologists part of the massive post-war boom in higher education, didn't slow down for 20 years, and the duo spent most of this time in the catbird seat of professional resources. To give you an example, in the late 50s, when this moment is happening, of Mills's marginalization from American sociology, consider the 25 papers that were delivered at the 1957 conventions of the American Sociology Society, the largest ever. This, as the title suggested, it was to be regarded as the most comprehensive introduction to the disciplines proliferating specialties and growing methodological self-consciousness. Talcott Parsons contributed to this book, Chapter 1, General Theory in Sociology. Lazarusfeld contributed Chapter 2, Problems in Methodology. Merton wrote the introduction and co-edited the volume. Sociology Today sold 10,000 copies in the first 2 months. Mills wasn't mentioned, not even in the footnotes. So that's the background. Mills comes into the college by the back door, and then he's on Columbia College, marginalized from the main action, and with no political rights. So as long as this institutional division of reputation and responsibility was in place, the two sides could keep themselves, could hold one another at a reasonable distance. Mills would sneer at the specialists that Merton and Lazarusfeld were producing in Fairweather. Lazarusfeld and Merton condescended to him in Hamilton. But still, it was quite evident to partisans on both sides what was happening. Mills, at some point, 58, 59, became friendly with Carlos Fuentes, and I interviewed Fuentes about their relationship. Mills was key for establishing Fuentes in the North American market, he told me. And he said that he was once walking with Mills on campus here when Lazarusfeld came into sight and abruptly turned around and walked sharply in another direction. Fuentes said there was a cloud of hatred against Mills on that campus. I saw it with my own eyes. The problem came in 1957. The problem that eventually ended Mills's, I think, functional relationship with Columbia, much earlier than is often assumed, came in the autumn of 1957, when Mills sent back word that he'd have to stay in Austria, where his wife was divorcing him from the inside of a psychiatric facility. She's, believe me, a whole other story. And was going to be missing classes. At the last minute, in fact, 3 replacement teachers had to be hired to take over his Columbia College courses. Somebody also had to take over his duties as the college's sociology representative. And Lazarusfeld, frankly, used the occasion to move against him, saying that he believed that Mills, in relaying the story of his wife's illness, was trying to trick the department into allowing him to extend his stay in Europe. Lazarusfeld summarily fired him from his post as representative to the college. With Merton's backing, he proposed to hire another sociologist to bring some order to the department. Lazarusfeld says in an oral history interview on file here on campus, "We just didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore." He was, by any liberal standards, academically acceptable. Lazarusfeld, in fact, wanted to fire him outright. Mills, as was his temperament, erupted in a fit of exasperated indignation at what he called these stupid bastards in sociology at Columbia. He wrote to the dean of the college, who was at that time Lawrence Chamberlain, to convey his displeasure. Then he wrote to Louis Kosar to recruit him as an envoy, asking him for the names of sociologists to offer up as alternatives. "Until now, I have not really fought these people in American sociology," he said, which wasn't true. "I've ignored them and done my own work, but now they've been fooling around behind the scenes, and now I declare war. I'm going to expose their essential bankruptcy." He did manage to quell sentiment for Lazarusfeld and Merton's first choice for the appointment. But by the time he had returned to campus from Austria, they really had something interesting in mind. They were brandishing the name of the one man they knew he could never abide, Daniel Bell. And now there's a whole backstory to the Bell story that we don't have time to get into, but they were Mills and Bell. Well, if we'll hear the audio, then it'll become more apparent. But Bell told me that when this decision was happening, he went to Mills's apartment to sound out his position on the matter, whether he would be opposing or not. And he said that he was coy. But as soon as Bell departed, actually the next day, we were able to date it. Mills wrote to Dean Chamberlain to say he didn't want Paul Lazarsfeld to exercise the right of hiring in the college, and he damn sure didn't want Daniel Bell as a colleague. So at this point, Dean Chamberlain agreed to hear the opinion of an ad hoc committee to break the stalemate. On the committee was David Truman, a professor of government, who was the chair. Also on the committee was Richard Hofstadter, Charles Frankel, and Lazarsfeld and Mills. The procedure was straightforward. Lazarsfeld and Mills were to put forward their first choices. The committee would then debate the choices, and then it would file a report to Chamberlain in whose hands the decision would rest. Lazarsfeld, as expected, nominated Daniel Bell. Now Mills, I know this is inside baseball, but bear with me. Mills nominated Morrow Berger, who was at that time an assistant professor of sociology at Princeton University and a close friend of Daniel Bell's. Bell was absolutely shocked when I told him that Mills had put up his friend against him. But the decision was effectively made in May of 1958, a couple of months later, when Bell took the platform at a colloquium similar to this environment and tried to annihilate the power elite in a talk where Merton and Lazarus sat in the back and clapped while Mills was not invited. This, if you're a reader of Daniel Bell's and you know his book, The End of Ideology, the talk that he gave at Columbia ended up in that book, and in fact was a very important moment for Bell. 3 days after Bell's performance, David Truman, Hofstadter, and Frankel all filed their report with Chamberlain. The feeling of the committee majority is that Mr. Bell would be an addition of major importance to the college and the university, and that it would be a serious mistake not to bring him to Columbia. This is the report that I found on file at Columbia Honor Room. The quality and range of his published work is most impressive, and we feel that his mind and personality are of a sort ideally fitted to the needs and the best traditions of teaching in Columbia College. The committee report regretted to note that one of the members had refused to yield. We have discussed the obvious disadvantages stemming from the appointment of a man not agreeable to the other senior sociologists in the college, and we've been forced to the conclusion that when we are faced, in our judgment, by a choice between securing the services of a first-rate man and promoting congeniality within the department, our responsibilities to the college and to the university obligate us to place considerations of intellectual quality first. Dean Chamberlain telephoned Mills 10 days later to say that he had decided to accept the committee's recommendations. Chamberlain said, "Wright has been most reasonable," in a letter to Lazarsfeld. He continues to believe that Daniel Bell is not the best man available, but in his own words, he shouldn't stand in the way of the report because it represents a carefully considered analysis of the problems. Functionally speaking, that was the end of Mills's career at Columbia. His reputation never recovered among his colleagues, and he stayed away over the next 2.5 years as consistently as he could, traveling. He was also very sick and not showing up for classes. In 1959, he published, as promised, The Sociological Imagination, which was a direct attack on Lazarsfeld and a sneaky attack on Merton. There's a hidden reference to Robert Merton in one of the chapters. The story, which began in 1945 with this great 7-hour talking jag and dinner and with great promise, ended with all three men, very famous, and Mills on the outs. So there's two moments that kind of frame the story. The third moment, and again, I'm emphasizing things that I've discovered in the research, and this was the best one, came after Mills's death, a few weeks. This was on April 16th, 1962. In Harkness Theater, there was a commemorative meeting attended by about 150 people who came to mourn, sort of, Mills's death. I think only Mills could have been made the subject of such a contentious affair. The sociology department, as you'll hear in a moment, sponsored the meeting, but Merton and Lazarus specifically declined to attend. In a Columbia oral history, a few months later, Lazarus called Mills a man of great gifts and said he admired his erudition, but their long feud had taken an irreversible toll. The sociological imagination, he said, it seemed to him as a work of ruthless egotism. In fact, Lazarus neither attended the commemorative meeting nor wrote Mills's widow, Yaroslava, a condolence letter. He specifically refused to write her a condolence letter. He says, "I absolutely refused, even after his death, to have anything to do with him. That is to say, I never regretted whatever harm I might have done. You see, I had the absolutely opposite feeling. Not only did I not regret, nor did I not feel that it would be embarrassing now that he would know all what I think about him, but I made it an external point not to take the slightest notice of whether he was dead or not." Mills's one-time best friend and a more reasonable former colleague, Richard Hofstadter, sent a short and dignified note to the affair, and another Columbia professor, Charles Frankel, spoke well, as did Walter Klink and William Tabor, former students and research assistants, who described Mills as the kind of teacher who changed lives. And the person who presided over this affair was, of course, Daniel Bell. So we're going to hear 8 minutes of the opening of the commemorative meeting of 1962, and to my knowledge, this is the first time that it's been played publicly, for sure.
I'm not so sure that this would be so completely a solemn occasion. I don't think Wright Mills would have wanted that completely. This is not really a memorial meeting or a eulogy meeting. This is primarily, the best word we could find, a commemorative meeting.
And this is Daniel Bell.
Which is sponsored by the Columbia College Sociology Department for one of its colleagues. It's always hard to begin a meeting of this kind, as I think you can all understand. What we're going to try to do is to have simply short statements, not really speeches, reminiscences, if you will, comments, recollections by various individuals who, in one way or another, worked with Wright Mills. We have Hans Gerth, who was one of his early teachers with whom he collaborated on the studies of Max Weber. Robert S. Lind, professor emeritus here at Columbia, who brought Lind to Columbia. Charles Frankel, who ran a seminar for several years with Lind. Louis Kozer, one of the editors of Dissent, a professor of sociology at Brandeis, a magazine with which Mills collaborated for a number of years. Some former students and junior colleagues, such as Walter Klink and William Tabor, who had worked with Mills and in one way or another would want to add some recollections about him. Mills came to Columbia in 1945, and except for a short period of time at the University of Maryland, spent almost his entire academic life at Columbia. He was a man who, as any of you who've had any contact with him at all know, was a rather extraordinary individual with a tremendous amount of drive. I find myself rather mixed feelings in talking about Mills because in some way my own acquaintance with him goes back about 20 years. I suspect, except for Cy Good, who was a fellow student of his at Texas, a fellow Texan, in one way or another, I suspect my own relations with Mills is probably longer than most people about here, and it's been a mixed set of relations. And I like to think of Mills in terms of the kind of person he was, in terms of both the agreements and disagreements that I've had with him, as a way of understanding him as a person. I first met Wright Mills, we used to call him Charles at the time, or Charlie. Wright became more formalized as a later name, when he was a graduate student at Texas, a graduate student at Wisconsin, and I at that time was the managing editor of a small weekly paper called The New Leader. I'd read some articles of Mills in the journals, and I thought they were very vigorous and quite interesting, and quite out of the ordinary. And I wrote to him and said, would you like to do some writing for the new leader? And he agreed. And beginning about 1942, I think the first writing that Wright Mills ever did, outside of the first academic articles, was for the new leader. He went about 1942 to the University of Maryland, which itself was a peculiar choice, I suppose, and yet in some of these accidental concatenations of academic routes, it was a meeting ground for a large number of people, all of whom had rather spectacular careers since. Because Wright became very friendly at that time with Dick Hofstadter, who was teaching in Maryland at the time, with Frank Friedel, who had come down there, and with a number of other young historians. And they represented a rather vigorous group of people at the University of Maryland, who were there for about 3 or 4 years, and subsequently then went elsewhere. Hofstadter and Mills coming up to Columbia, Friedel finally going on to Harvard, and some of the others going elsewhere. And that, I think one went to Berkeley, one of the other historians, whose name for the moment unfortunately escapes me. Mills at the time, when he was at Maryland, began doing quite a bit of writing. As I say, he began contributing to the new leader, and began writing the journals. I think he came to the attention of Bob Lind, who had a rather vigilant eye for some vigorous young talent, particularly talent which was radical, which had a certain drive and burst of energy. And Lind, I think, began to see in Mills a potential person at Columbia. One of the things which I can, perhaps without any, since it's all part of the past, talk about now is the fact that a certain degree of anger I had impersonally at Professor Lind at the time, because Lind said to Mills after he first met him, why do you want to write for the new leader? That's not the kind of magazine you want to write for. Why don't you write for the New Republic? And he introduced Wright Mills to the editors of the New Republic, who had their headquarters in New York at the time, and Mills began writing for the New Republic. So I got some rather contrite letters from him saying, well, you know, you understand, they pay $75 an article, and besides which, you don't really pay, and besides, I don't know if I really wholly agree with you anyway, and I'm glad you gave me a chance to write for the leader, but, and this went on in this particular respect. For a period of years, Mills and I had correspondence. Then when he used to come up to New York, particularly when his first job, I don't think it was actually at Columbia College. There was a very involved set of negotiations with putting first in the Bureau. He was working for the Bureau of Applied Social Research beginning in 1945 and coming up to New York and staying with me at my place. And we used to get into some long arguments, some of which would ended, I suspect, in rather sharp political disagreements. But one of the things which always comes through in that is this extraordinary drive of the man, because it seems to me drive almost becomes the key word. And looking through some old letters last night, and some letters I had from Mills at the time, let me just, perhaps without violating anybody's sense of privacy, read just one excerpt which seems to me typifies so much of the man himself. This is a footnote. This has been some correspondence about a project which he was engaged already in February 7, 1945, in the Intellectuals. And he was at that time trying to deal with runs of various magazines and trying to argue that one could identify key intellectual currents through the articles in the magazines. And he was going to have here, as he says, a 50-year project. It was rather typical of the man. He says, you see, in the end, about 50 years from now, we might very well expand to the sociology of the left, covering intellectuals, political, literary magazines, as well as several actual movements. And this was his image of time. He was going to think about a 50-year period. He wasn't just going to do a little Pickean study of the magazines at the time. This was going to build into a large-scale project. And then at the end, he has a scrawled footnote, handwritten footnote, which says 10 p.m. And he says, the smaller war plants just phoned, want me to do a 6-week study starting tomorrow of the effects of different industry types in 6 towns via plane. Good God. Sort of fortune level journalese on small business. Want an article? Then he says on the other side, after the study, I would have to appear before the Senate committee as expert on sociology of small business. And then he writes, ladies and gentlemen, introducing the sociologists of small business. Found in a wild onion patch 40 miles from the sea and 40 miles from land.
There's a lot more to that. But if we had more time, I would talk to you a little bit more about Robert Lind, who's on another clip. He spends 22 minutes during this commemorative service denouncing Mills. And at one point, you can hear it, Hans Gerth, whom Bell mentions was Mills's former teacher at Wisconsin and who had flown in for the service, interjects and tries to rush the podium at Lind out of this anger. So Mills is the only person that I've come across so far that was denounced at his own funeral. And I think I'll just end there. Thank you very much. Anybody want to chat?
And what was the nature of the disagreement with Lind or the controversy?
With Lind, I mean, Robert Lind is an interesting figure. He's not much mentioned anymore. And as far as I know, there isn't a biography or a major study of his work, but he was a very important sociologist, and he was a former Presbyterian minister who had kind of drifted into sociology. And Lind felt that Mills had misappropriated some funds in the department, and he didn't like Mills's style of haggling for raises. It offended his what he called his Midwestern sensibility. But I think more to the point, he also really disliked the power elite. He thought that the book was, he said so, he wrote a long critique of it in The Nation. And I thought it was a strange relationship because the conceptions of power are not exactly antithetical. They're actually very closely aligned, Mills and Lind. There's also some sense that Lind had felt mistreated in the department, and by the time Mills came along as the hotshot young sociologist who outstripped him and became more well-known and began to occupy a place in the culture that Lind had briefly entertained in the 30s, that he became bitter. But those kind of things have to be asserted with a lot of evidence. But otherwise, it's not entirely clear to me why Lind felt that he needed to denounce Mills. But at some point, this recording, I hope, will be published, and you can hear it for yourself.
Yeah, I have two questions. One, I wonder if you ever ran into the Waco iconoclast in
The what? I'm
the
sorry?
Waco iconoclast in. It was because it was the late 1800s or whatever, and I just wondered. Just was interesting that this is the sense that Mill came out of. And I thought the second question was he very popular with the students? I mean, it sounds like he was very popular with the undergraduate students.
Yes. Yeah, as Ty mentioned, he dressed in a flamboyant way, and he was a very clear and forceful lecturer, which is, as Bell told me, he was a very good lecturer. He held the students' attention. The fact that he was also a figure outside the university was an additional point in his favor. So he was quite popular, but there's an anecdote that I heard of Mills at a party where a bunch of sociology graduate students are, and this is in the late 50s, and he's fairly well known at this time, and he's sitting in the corner, and the students are filing past, and he's saying, what are you studying? And they're saying what they're studying, and to every single person he says, why? So there was a great divergence with graduate students, which was a shame.
Yeah, do you know why he had a falling out with Richard Hofstadter?
Well, Hofstadter died, I believe it was 1972, and long before I came on the scene doing interviews, but I did interview his widow, and it's not clear that they did have a falling out. Hofstadter wasn't the type to have a lot of fallings out. But when the Cuba book was published in 1960, Mills went to Havana, interviewed Fidel Castro, and wrote a book about it. Hofstadter was just sort of appalled at the swerve that he had taken toward revolutionary nationalism. So the political differences were very sharp by that time. And by the end of the 60s, Hofstadter himself is feeling quite alienated and out of sorts as Mills's followers changed the culture from within. And the great moment is the commencement address that Hofstadter gave in 1968, which I think is on your mind as an important point in Columbia's history. Frank Friedel, who was mentioned earlier, it was Kenneth Stant, actually. One of the historians that Mills befriended at Maryland was walking with Richard Hofstadter in front of the library, after the 68 rebellion or protest. I don't know what the official term is here. And Stamp said to Hofstadter, oh, Charlie would have been in his element. And Hofstadter apparently took the opposite view and said, no, on the contrary, he would have been appalled at the desecration of the campus. And that's an interesting thing to discuss or to think about. There are arguments on both sides. Yes?
Would you happen to know whether any of Columbia's legendary beats studied under Mills?
I've not come across any of that, no. But I have been able to place Allen Ginsberg and Mills at Norman Mailer's famous party where he stabbed his wife. And apparently Ginsberg was aware of Mills's feud with Columbia Sociology and was asking him how he was handling these guys, right? And they left the party together in the elevator. That's the best I've got. I'm sorry. I'm an editor and a biographer, which means I'm a gossip. So if I had more, I would give it to you. Yes.
Just curious if you can speak to Mill's experience in the military school and whether or not that affected his trajectory through sociology, or.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the formulations I'm trying to advance is military school was where he discovered society. Later at Texas is where he discovered sociology. And he discovered society in a very brutal form. He had a very terrible incident happen halfway through his time at Texas A&M. This is 1934. He was involved with a wrestling match in which he broke somebody's arm. And there was thought on campus that he had maybe done it on purpose. And there was some thought from Mills's own journals that he was pretty upset at the beatings that he had been getting from the upperclassmen, because this is a pretty harsh environment, and he had suffered beatings, and then the incident happened. In the spring then of 1935, the campus, the cadets all ostracized him. No one spoke to him for the entire semester socially. He was a non-entity. Ostracism is the kind of textbook definition of what happened to him. And he really had a nervous collapse after that, and always discussed it later as a point of formation, and then went to Texas, which was at the time a sissy school, according to the cadets, and dove in to try to recover some of the experience and formulate his own sociology. So it was an entirely negative experience, and he protests by writing letters to the editor. There's a paper trail. Yes?
So what was the net results of Blakely for the department when he lost his...
The net result?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Wright Mills lost his strike at the end of the...
Yeah, well, Bell was on the faculty.
So did it swing the department to the right?
Well, the department was not on the left or the right. It was occupying a scientific, professionally neutral position. That's what the writings very clearly say. I mean, if you take Robert Merton, for example, and maybe we can talk about this, Merton was a beautiful stylist and a beautiful writer, but was in his writings clearly against style and rhetoric. He thought that sociology was a science and would be developing into a science. They all did. They established the leading cutting edge of sociology in the 50s. That was the position. Not that they were right or the left, but that they were neutral. So the question, those are the terms of the discussion. So I don't think they were right or left or in the department. I mean, Bell left, I think, after '68, and went to Harvard. And I'm not quite sure exactly how to answer the question, but that's what happened.
I also see Wright Mills was left of center.
Well, he was a left-wing. He was probably the most influential left-wing American intellectual of the 20th century. But his conception of sociology did not imply any particular political position. It's tricky, but it's actually true that the discussion is not over politics. The discussion is how to go about sociology. Mills, the initial draft for Mills's famous book, The Sociological Imagination, was called Social Science as a Way of Life. And I read you the discussion about using your life experiences in your work and incorporating them, that was totally anathema to Merton and Lazarus. It was not allowed. It was disreputable to do that sort of thing. Yes.
I beg to differ about the political neutrality of the sociology department. Certainly when I entered Barnard in the fall of '68, we thought of Daniel Bell as evil right-wing guy, and that feeling about Daniel Bell continued for at least 15 years.
Yeah.
So I totally disagree with what you said.
Well, you said you had a feeling that he was maybe right-wing, but that doesn't
No,
mean that he
no,
was
I didn't,
right-wing.
no, I didn't say it was my feeling. I
Right.
said it was the general view of students.
No,
and
well,
young faculty.
and I think Mills was responsible to that, I think, to a large extent, because he named Bell in his letter to the New Left, but
It wasn't just that. I mean, later on when Bell in one hand issued the report on the family,
yeah.
that was regarded by the New Left as a very reactionary report. Now we might see it differently, but certainly Daniel Bell did represent a right-wing position in the 60s and 70s. I can't speak to earlier.
We'll take one last question, and then there's a reception next time. Right here. Yes,
What I was looking at the sociological imagination, and I was very startled when I read his phrase, the cheerful robot, and where he started to take a very negative sort of view toward technology. How much does that develop in his writing, or an interest of his?
Well, the cheerful robot first appears, I don't think it's much to do with technology as such, but it appears in White Collar first. And the book is a fairly devastating, carries a fairly devastating hypothesis that the trouble is we cannot come to a collective self-consciousness. That's the thesis of the book. And the cheerful robot is a kind of residue of what we would now think of as the happiness industry. I mean, what's more common in American society than the urge to smile and to be happy? I mean, there was an undercurrent of criticism. I mentioned the underground culture of the 50s. The Beats were involved with this, but it came from many different directions, trying to undermine this core proposition of the post-war American, what Mills called the American celebration. The cheerful robot is the kind of character, ideal type of the American triumphal celebration.
It just seemed like there were different places where he seemed to be kind of pushing in a different direction that might have, made people uncomfortable because it wasn't fully fleshed out, but that there was some discomfort maybe then related to, the military and their involvement in the development of technology. It seemed, I don't know if I'm over-reading that in him. But
no, I think, and I know we want to conclude, but I'll just say, I mean, what I've presented today is the starkest, most this polarity as possible. Mills was, and they had this in common with Merton, a very sophisticated sociological theorist, and one of the things that leads him to the cheerful robot is this idea of rationality without reason, which was something that Karl Mannheim had put on the map for American intellectuals. And Bell and Lazarus and Merton and Mills, they all proceeded from Karl Mannheim. And ultimately, it's a Weberian critique. So it's not so much technology, it's more the relation of technology and culture as framed as an ideological problem. I'm happy to continue to talk at the reception. So.